Hello, this tutorial is going to walk you through how to set up the Machiavelli essay outline. As a reminder, this is homework tonight. You should have the sample paper that you see on the screen in front of you, and I would encourage that as I walk through the process that you take notes and write down any questions that you have for clarification. There will be a check quiz in class, and you will be allowed to use this sample, but if you do not understand the parts of the sample in front of you, you will not successfully complete the quiz. I would also encourage that as you listen to the tutorial, you pause every couple minutes because listening to my voice can become fatiguing. Take a break, come back, and you should be okay. So, just as a reminder, we are looking at the question, were Machiavellian principles necessary to make a leader strong and successful? So on your essay outline, your job is to take this question and to turn it into a thesis. A reminder, this is a historical analysis question, and to develop a thesis means it's an assertion or an argument, professional argument, that is going to take one side or the other. So you are either going to argue that Machiavellian principles were necessary to make a political leader strong and successful, or were not necessary. Now, political leader can mean anybody, but in this case, we've been looking at absolute monarchs, people who had absolute power in Europe and abroad, and they used their power as a way to lead their country. And you're trying to determine not just were they successful and strong, but with that success and strength, were Machiavellian principles necessary? Or could a leader be strong without using Machiavellian principles and still find that strength and success? So it's really going to be up to you what side of the thesis you take. Now you're going to notice in the paper in front of you, there are two samples. Sample A is page 1 and sample B is page 2. The example that I'm going to use for this essay outline tutorial is a monarch that you are not covering for your own essay. So do not copy my specs and analysis from this tutorial because you are not learning about Louis XIII. This is simply being done to show you the differences of how to set up the outline. So in sample A, the side of the outline that I'm taking, the first thing you need to do is you examine your evidence. And I gave you the Machiavelli filter, and that filter is to help you look at all the domestic and foreign policies of Peter the Great, is who we started with. And then eventually you'll look at either Elizabeth or Louis XIV, and you'll look at a leader from abroad. And your job is to collect your evidence first. And as you collect that evidence, you should have done three things. First, classify as domestic or foreign. Second, specify what Machiavellian principles it's reflecting or working against. And third, decide if you believe that in that case, the leader showed success and strength or did not show success and strength. And from there, that should help you determine what side of the thesis you're going to take. So the first thing you need to do before you do anything else is create your thesis. So if you look right here, the thesis for sample A is taking the side that Machiavellian principles were necessary to make the absolute leaders in Europe and abroad strong and successful. You're going to notice that I specify, instead of just saying political leaders, I'm now saying the absolute leaders in Europe and abroad, because you're going to have to look at one example of a foreign leader that is outside of Europe. And so everything I do needs to work to prove this statement correct. So as note taking, you can call this your professional argument. You can state that this is the statement you are trying to prove true. Everything you do works to this. If you don't have an argument, you can't do your outline. So the first thing you should do is this. You're going to notice, though, the way that I create my thesis is I take the question and I reword it into an argument using the words from the question. The words that I added were necessary, show my side of the argument. I am saying Machiavellian principles are necessary in order for a leader to be strong or successful. For sample B, if you go to sample B, which is page 2, you're going to notice we're not, meaning a leader can still show success and strength, but not necessarily follow the principles of Machiavelli or work against the principles and still find success. Okay? So step 1. Step 2 is you are going to create a statement. You're going to choose your 3 monarchs. So under thesis, it says A, B, and C. This is the rule. A matches Roman numeral 2. So your A statement would be something like Louis XIII, King of France, was a strong leader. And that's what you're going to prove. This sentence becomes your Roman numeral 2 sentence. So actually, I already have a sentence created. So I would say Louis XIII followed the King of France, because I do want to specify where he's from, followed the advice of Machiavelli to strengthen his power and to control France, to control his country. All right. So you're going to notice I'm working on the spot here to kind of show you the process. So I'll say it again. The A statement under thesis matches your Roman numeral 2 statement. We call this the proof statement. These are the 3 proof areas of your essay. There will be 5 paragraphs total, 1 introduction, 3 body paragraphs or proof paragraphs, and a closing. So A, B, and C make up your 3 body proof paragraphs, and each one will be a monarch. So the first monarch, which is my example and not going to be used for class, is Louis XIII. Yours would be Peter the Great. Your second monarch will either be Louis XIV of France or Elizabeth I of England. And your third monarch, there are going to be 8 choices from countries outside of Europe, and you're going to choose the one that you want to reflect your thesis the best. Okay? So that's A, B, and C. Once again, proof statements, body paragraph of your essay. Take note of that. Then, the following outline samples include the subtopics A and B specs along with analysis. So I'm actually showing you a completed outline to show you how to set up yours. Make sure you change the words of the sentence though and do not copy mine word for word. So your role is looking at Louis XIII, which is your first proof area. You will have what is an A and a B section. The A section should focus on domestic policies. So both specs for A should be domestic policies. I would take note of that. So for 1 and 2, we're bringing those back. We are going to be saying many of Louis XIII's domestic policies and actions reflected Machiavellian principles. You're going to notice that when I write, I'm creating a funnel. I start up here just saying, controlling his entire country, he followed Machiavelli. Now I'm going to funnel a little bit into talking about his domestic principles or policies. And remember, domestic policy are things that happened just in France that affected the French people, not dealing with another country. So be careful. And I purposely have asked you to classify your evidence as domestic or foreign. So you need to sift through your evidence and choose the 2 best domestic policies for that monarch that you think would prove your thesis correct. Okay, so we have the A statement. So here's how it works. In the essay, we are going to add back our 1s and 2s, and the 1s and 2s job is to narrow in to introduce the specs. This is what we call the supporting details statement, where we are trying to introduce the specific specs that you're going to talk about. I know this may get a little confusing because we've been working on A specs analysis, but what I'm asking for is for domestic policies, I want 2 specs. So in order to do it correctly, you have to have a 1 and a 2 statement because they're going to introduce the specs that you're talking about. So you've put your A statement in. You can copy this A statement and just change the words Peter the Great. So you could say many of Peter the Great's domestic policies and actions reflected Machiavellian principles. And I'm okay with that because what you're showing is you're going to talk to me about his domestic policies, and that's going to be different than the words I have below. So what I would do in my next step is I would actually skip my 1 statement and I would put my specs or specific example, which is my fact, my unbiased detailed fact into the statement. So my fact is this. In 1627, Louis XIII sent French troops to lay siege to the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle. After intense fighting, Louis's troop won, which forced a surrender, and by the terms of the Peace of Alais, the Huguenots lost their territorial, political, and military rights in France. That's my fact. And my fact in my brain, I thought to myself, okay, this was an action created by Louis, which does reflect the Machiavellian principles. I want to make sure, though, I now need to build the story around it about how. You're going to notice in my specs, I don't say anything about Machiavelli. My specs is simply an action or a policy taken by the absolute monarch. I would take note of that right now. Then at the end of my specs, you're going to notice an in-text citation. Now, if it's Peter the Great video, you'll put Peter the Great video notes. If it's your textbook, it's text and the page number. If it's a document, you will put Elizabeth Doc 1 or the page number. So you'd put Elizabeth Doc, comma, whatever the page on the doc is. So you do need to specify. If it has an author at the end, you need to put the author's last name, as we've learned. If you do not put an in-text citation, you will not pass. The other thing you need to remember is the specific example needs to be written as a complete sentence. It says right up here in your outline, use complete sentences, but I cannot stress this enough. Your notes are written as bullets. You need to turn those bullets into a complete sentence. If it's the Peter the Great notes, you do not put direct quotes, but you still need an in-text citation, because from the video, you didn't write down word for word exactly what the narrator was saying. So you don't put quotes, but you do put quotes if you get the information from a document. So the difference, if it's the video, paraphrase, no quotes. If it's from a document, you need to use direct quotes. In either case, regardless of if it has quotes or not, you always have an in-text citation at the end. No in-text citation, no credit for the specs. You will not pass Comp 2. Please don't forget that step. Okay, so that's my specs. So now I need to build the story around it. So what you're going to do for one, and this is what I would take note of. One is your supporting detail that will not only introduce the specs, but it will also introduce how it relates to Machiavelli. So I state, Machiavelli encouraged a prince to appear religious. Remember, that's one of his principles. And then I introduce the specs. Being a Catholic, one group Louis took action against was the Huguenots, the Protestants of France. So I've given my reader two things here that you need to do, and I would write this down for a note. First, I've alluded to the Machiavellian principle that it will relate to. And second, I've introduced what the specs will be about. So I've given my reader something to see. One, I'm telling them that it relates to this principle. And two, I'm telling them what the specs will be about. If you are taking the opposite, and I'm going to scroll down to show you sample B, it's the same idea. You allude to what the principle is going to be. So Machiavelli encouraged princes not to be too cruel, but I put the word but Louis took actions that were cool to keep his power. So I'm introducing the specs, but in this time I allude to the Machiavelli principle, but I explain how Louis is going to do the opposite of that principle and still show strength and success. Okay? Then I do the analysis statement. So once again, I hope you're taking notes. The analysis statement is going to accomplish two things. First, it's going to explain how Louis followed Machiavelli's belief and why that was a good thing. Second, it's going to explain how Louis was a strong or successful leader. So your monarch, the first thing you need to do is you would say, Louis followed Machiavelli's belief of using the religious establishment to gain power by siding with the powerful Catholic Church and decreasing the power of the Huguenots in France. So I'm explaining to my reader with this first sentence how Louis has accomplished Machiavelli's beliefs to show that strength and success. Okay, so step one of the analysis is to explain how he's following the principle. Second sentence should be explaining how that makes him a strong or successful leader. So I say, through these actions and following Machiavelli's principles, Louis demonstrated his strength as a leader because he made the Catholic Church, his religion, the dominant power in his country. So notice I've bolded strength. I'm alluding to my thesis. In my thesis, I'm saying Machiavellian principles were necessary to make a leader strong and successful. So with my first sentence, I'm showing how the Machiavellian principles were necessary. And in my second sentence, I'm explaining how that made Louis a strong leader. So your analysis statements are going to need two sentences. First, an explanation of how it proves that Machiavelli's principles were necessary. And second, how it proves that the leader was either strong or successful or both. Okay, so please take note of that. Your analysis statement will have two sentences and make sure you can explain both of them. If I was taking the opposite, which I want to show you quickly, I would do the same thing, but in this case, I would actually say how working against the principle still made him strong. So the difference here is, in order to maintain his power, Louis took steps, even cruel ones, like the killing of Leonardo Dori Galagai, which Machiavelli would have argued was too cruel. So I'm showing how he's working against the Machiavellian principle, yet I'm explaining how he's still a strong leader. Yet through this action, Louis demonstrated his strength as a leader, because the king made it clear that not only would individuals who worked against him would be killed, but so would their family, thus making the people less likely to overthrow him. So in this case, I'm following the same pattern, but this time I'm proving how Machiavelli principles are not necessary. So I refer to the principle and explain how Louis is working against it. And second, I explain how even though Louis works against it, he's still a strong leader because why? So I still have the two sentences. It's a little different in how you set them up. So make sure to look at sample B if you're saying they were not necessary. Okay? All right. I know it's a lot to take in, but this is really meant to help you be able to successfully complete the outline. This is a huge part of your grade. It is a big assessment. My strategies and my tutorial is here to help you find success. I mentioned this at the beginning, but I would not have watched this all the way through. You should have taken notes on each of the sections to be able to explain to me what is actually being shown on the sample. You can use the sample and your notes as part of the check quiz, but if you cannot explain why the sentences are there, you will not pass the quiz, nor will you pass the assessment. So just a quick reminder. The 2 is your overall statement about Louis. A is going to be about your domestic policies, which if you haven't figured it out, there's 2 specs required for that. B, since there's a B statement under 2 as well, that's going to be about Louis' foreign policies, which I didn't focus on. I just did the A section for the outline. But B would be about his foreign policies, and I would have 2 specs that prove his foreign policies. And I would follow the same pattern. The only difference is the word domestic would change to foreign, and my specs would be about France's interactions with other countries. Okay? 1 is the introduction to what principle it's either working with or against, and introducing the specs that you're going to talk about. That is your supporting detail statement. Your specs should have a lead into your quote if you use direct quotes. If not, it should still be a complete sentence with an in-text citation at the end. If it's Peter the Great, you should not have direct quotes. If it's Elizabeth, Louis, and your other monarch from abroad, they should have direct quotes. And finally, your analysis statements is because explaining how your spec supports the thesis. The first sentence should explain how either it works with Machiavelli's principles or against. And the second statement should explain how those actions either demonstrated strength, either working with the principle or against the principle, depending on which side you take. Once again, if you have any questions or clarifications, don't hesitate to ask. Good luck.